thank you for joining me again. We're back for another week. This series, we're tackling this monster stack of folders on construction. Last week we did ancient construction and primitive construction. This week we're going to do construction, miscellaneous, and a little folder I found on architects with a few really fascinating facts on Christopher Wren. But then we're going to get into building materials, chimneys, buildings, all kinds of stuff. Can't believe this. But, I was thinking about this stack in particular. My father grew up with Strange as It Seems when it was actually being published. My grandmother was running the comic strip when he was young. He was born in 1936. Ended up taking it over just in the last few years in the late 60s. But he always told me he was a builder. He built houses, and he knew from a very young age that he wanted to be a builder and build houses. And as I was going through this, I thought, you know what? I wonder if these facts, and maybe playing in these folders like I did as a kid, where you just read all this fascinating information and looked at the pictures and the photographs and all of that, I was just wondering, I bet this had quite a bit to do with my dad's decision and fascination into becoming a builder. And maybe this will inspire somebody else as well. So let's dive into this week's episode on construction, miscellaneous, and architects. And we're going to find out, believe it or not, there was a 17-story building built on a 3-foot lot. Can you believe that? All kinds of really interesting. And did you know that when King James, I guess it was describing a work of Christopher Wren's, he said that it was amusing, awful, and artificial, and that was actually a really nice compliment. Go figure. So, some more strange and unusual facts ahead. Let's dive in. Welcome back. This is Jeff Hicks, curator of the Strange as It Seems archives and grandnephew of John Hicks, who created Strange as It Seems back in the late 1920s. We're going to go into construction and architects this week. Really interesting stuff here. But before we do, I'd like to ask, please hit the bell to subscribe, hit the button to like, and by all means leave a comment if any of this inspires you or reminds you. I've even had comments from people who said, hey, that's my great-grandfather. So a lot of interesting people and facts being surfaced here. Love the conversation, love the engagement. It goes a long way to helping me bring this almost 100-year-old, it's a 98-year-old brand this year, back for the digital age. As I've been diving into the archives, and I always thought it was interesting that they were organized by subject, which is absolutely perfect for us as we go through these in the coming years, because every folder is a subject, and it kind of gathered all the Strange as It Seems of the day into different subject matter. And it was usually around this John Hicks scrapbook. And I realized really that's how he was organizing as he got into it. Because what would happen is in the Sunday comics in the 1930s, you'd have the Strange as It Seems Sunday comic, and then below it, if you can see that, is the John Hicks scrapbook. So he would do the typical Sunday comic, and then I guess the newspapers were also giving him another half page and a full page. And that's great. 1936, I'm going to be framing these and offering them in the Strange as It Seems marketplace. I think people would love. A lot of people have written in and asked and said, hey, can I have that article framed? And can I have that comic framed? But that's really what organized these. And this is the one that's going to kick off today. And this is kind of the black and white version, and with the numbers. And on the back, he would show the date of the comic strip and where he sourced it. But here's some pretty good rapid fire, fascinating things. At least it was in, when was this? 1937. So October 10th, 1937. So on the left side, we've got Skyscrapers. This is a pretty interesting fact. The Empire State Building, which at the time was the world's tallest structure, then was surpassed by the World Trade Center, and now is still the largest building in New York. But it leans when the wind blows, but it leans into the wind. Isn't that interesting? A cold wind on a sunny day can cause one side to contract while the other expands. And so when you're standing there, if you can detect it with the human eye, it's actually leaning into the wind because of the contraction of the building due to the sun. Kind of amazing. There's a 4-story cooperative apartment house or houses with 800 rooms. This is in New Mexico, built by the prehistoric Americans. I think we featured that last week in Primitive and Ancient Construction. And how about these floating skyscrapers? This is in New Orleans Business District. They rest on thousands of 80-foot pilings that are driven into the mud, basically floating. And how about the world's first skyscraper? Here's a pretty interesting fact. Didn't even know it was a skyscraper. Stood for 46 years before anybody even thought of it as a skyscraper. And when it was torn down, this is the Home Insurance Building in Chicago, was actually found to be the earliest structure to fit the definition of what a skyscraper was. So the earliest skyscraper was there for 46 years before it knew it was the earliest skyscraper. Pretty amazing there. How about the more skyscrapers that are erected on Manhattan Island? The less weight there is on the island. Kind of amazing, because I guess what happens is when all the dirt and the rock are removed for the foundation for the skyscraper, all that removed dirt and rock way more than the skyscraper itself. So while they're building these skyscrapers, or were in the 1930s, they were actually making the island lighter. Crazy. And then the last one here in Shibam, Arabia, 14-story buildings, an entire metropolis made of mud. But when it rains about once in 10 years, many of them just collapse and they got to rebuild them, all built out of mud. And here's a building near where I grew up as a kid in Caltech. We used to go there, Caltech and JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratories. I remember a lot of field trips when I was a kid going to that campus next door to San Marino, where I grew up. And this is the Half and Half building. It's the Astrophysical Laboratory at Caltech. It's a 5-story structure, 2.5 stories above ground, 2.5 stories below ground. And a beautiful letter here from the Pasadena Chamber of Commerce. The new Astrophysical Laboratory, California Institute of Technology. That's great, from the manager of the Convention and Publicity Department. And another interesting building, this is a power plant, also 5 stories, but it's made of brick and concrete. It's anchored to the ground to prevent it floating away in a flood. Interesting, this is 4 miles west of Lawrence, Kansas. A cool illustration there of it, but they figured that if a flood, I guess the flood of 1843 and 1903 went into their computations, and they went into the bedrock, drilled several feet into the rock, but they put in dowels and steel rods so that it would uplift. So when the water came in, it wouldn't float away, but just lift up on these rods. How about that? This is from the Lawrence Daily Journal, Lawrence, Kansas, but a fact from 1941. Here's a couple from the Ernest Hicks era. My grandfather took over the comic strip for a few years. After my great-uncle John, his brother, died on D-Day, strange as it seems, June 6, 1944, of myocarditis, heart disease. Had nothing to do with the war. But here's a couple from him. There is the Railroad Roundhouse in Santa Barbara. Kind of cool. It was built to resemble a Spanish bull ring. Isn't that cool? Railroad Roundhouse. Beautiful photograph there. And then this is interesting. Have you ever heard of saltbox houses in the Northeast? But they have these really interesting sloping roofs. They're scattered throughout the East. And it's a salt box design, and people don't really know why it was done with these large sloping roofs, and it was designed to fool assessors into thinking that the house was smaller than it really was. So kind of a construction, I guess, on 2 stories on one side, but 1 story on the other, and basically to avoid paying taxes. Crazy. And this brings us to the Elsie Hicks era. She took over in 1948 when my grandfather, Ernest, died in a plane crash. Elsie loved history and oftentimes would kind of take the readers back to really interesting things in history, science, literature. Brilliant woman, actually, my grandmother was. And let's go through hers. These are really, really cool. You may have seen some of these buildings before. I haven't seen any of them, but I found them really fascinating. Here's the 300-ton stone. If you've ever seen, I've seen pictures of it. Theodoric's mausoleum in Ravenna, Italy. And I think it was right. I was looking this up. I think it was around, it was about AD 520 by Theodoric the Great. He was the Gothic ruler that kind of ruled from Ravenna, Italy. Built this beautiful building. I've never seen it, but apparently there's a 300-ton stone in the roof. Kind of an amazing, there's some old black and white photographs in here as well of it. Extraordinary piece of architecture. Speaking of which, the Shoso Inn Storehouse. This is in Nara, Japan. Has about 650 priceless treasures remarkably preserved, and there's no nails in this architecture. It's kind of like a log cabin type structure, again built around the 8th century, and it's been carried, the building itself, all around the world, again because you can just take it apart, put it back together, but it really was, the humidity in the area was really high, and so the timbers were arranged to basically absorb the damp, expand, and keep it airtight. Crazy and then allow ventilation in the drier months. Extraordinary piece of architecture there. As speaking of no nails, if you've ever seen the houses, I've seen pictures of them in the Bavarian Alps. They have all these rocks on them, and it's like, what are these rocks doing on the roof? But the winds are so strong that instead of nails, they actually use rocks to hold the roof down. That's kind of crazy. If you've ever been to San Antonio, Texas, this is, I think, built around the early 1930s or maybe the late 20s, but the Arneson River Theater, and it has incredible acoustics. The audience sits on one side of the river, the stage is on the other, and the acoustics are so great that there's no drawback. Great letter here from the San Antonio Chamber of Commerce. Tons of stories, by the way, from San Antonio. This is like so familiar. I've seen about 20 of these letters. I don't know what my family's fascination was with San Antonio, but that sounds like a really cool, I guess while you're watching the play, the riverboat, with all the tourists just comes by in the middle of the play. Crazy. And then here's one. This is the Thomas Jefferson. I love this one. I have been to Monticello. Two innovations there that are still in use today, or at least was in 1950s, right? Not only the insulated flooring, but these double glazed storm windows. And this came from Ted Ramsey, who wrote the letter to John Hicks in 1942. And he included a couple of photographs. This is great. Here's the actual storm window from Monticello, with a woman standing there for scale. And then I love this, and that was, written on the back, Thomas Jefferson's home, storm window erected in 1769. And then here's a 1942 style husband and wife there installing together the storm window of the exact same kind. So still Thomas Jefferson's invention. I think it's still being used today, right? Incredible. How about the Sears Roebuck building? I think this is in Boyle Heights here in LA. Had put on roller bearings, 600-pound roller bearings. Here's a letter corroborating that from the Sears Roebuck and Company, 1955. But it was like no other structure in the world. Basically, it was kind of built on roller skates for earthquakes. And I think there was a really pretty serious earthquake in 1952, the Tehachapi quake, and building performed beautifully. So it was kind of put on on roller skates or ball bearings to absorb for that. Here's an interesting project, the Kitimat Kamano Nechako project. It was right in the middle of being under construction, and Elsie Hicks, my grandmother, found out about it. She wrote first the Aluminum Company of America. Check out this letterhead. It actually looks like it's aluminum stamped on there. She wrote Alcoa Company in Pennsylvania, and they said, actually, that's not us. It's the Aluminum Company of Canada, who then wrote the letter. But really an extraordinary project. And I think this is a period of time when people were just really into architectural wonders, not really thinking about the environmental costs of a lot of this, because this definitely hugely impacted the salmon fisheries way up in the northwest of Canada, and certainly the Native American communities there that had been living there for centuries and generations. But interesting, the flow of water from a chain of lakes is being reversed from east to west, formed a reservoir, 150-mile long reservoir, a 10-mile tunnel, 25 feet in diameter, drilled through the mountains, created a headwater 16 times the height of Niagara. And then this powerhouse was basically built deep inside the mountains. So amazing engineering feats, and certainly before they were really focused in considering on the environmental impact of a lot of these things. But here's one that has a nice environmental impact. It's natural storage. It was a modern refrigerated warehouse. Basically, these guys, it's a private company, people who own the land there, they've been quarrying the limestone, and they realized after they had dug all this limestone out of the mountain that it's served as a refrigerated warehouse without any electricity. So 150,000 square feet of storage, and they built a little spur basically to the railroad. Here's the full brochure, ultra modern refrigerated warehouse in the heart of America. Pretty cool photographs, and they built a little spur to the railroad and served as a refrigerated warehouse. Now, this is my favorite one from the Elsie Hicks era. This is great. I led with this at the start of the episode, but she got this letter, right, from E.R. Merriman, and it was kind of a mystery. It was like, hey, enclosed postcard picture of the 3-foot, 17-story building in Meridian, Mississippi, and it's built on or supported by a 3-foot piece of land, and it's great. And basically the notes written on here, darned if I know, but the title on the postcard, and here's the postcard that was sent, and it was like, hey, we've got a 3-foot building, why not write in to maybe we can get some explanation, and could be possibly the best ever story, for strange as it seems. So, of course, my grandmother wrote in, check this out. So, replying to your letter with reference to our 17-story building built on a 3-foot piece of land. It wasn't built on a 3-foot piece of land. Apparently, it derived its name from the people that built it. It was the 3-foot brothers. So kind of crazy, but you got to give it to. I love this because this is, you were invited to Meridian, Mississippi. So apparently the founders, or the civic leaders of Meridian, were trying to celebrate Meridian, Mississippi as the heart of the New South, and they came up with this idea. And here's the brochure. Believe it or not, you can see a 17-story building on a 3-foot lot. It's the 3-foot brothers that own the lot. So I guess they were drawing a lot of attention. And you know what? Strange as it seems, said, what the heck, and published it anyway as 1952, 17-story building built on a 3-foot lot. We'll add these at the end here. There was a little folder on architects. Not enough really for an episode in and of itself, but I thought I'd just tack it on to the end. How about Sir Joseph Paxton? He overcame structural problems when designing London's famous Crystal Palace, and his inspiration was copying the structure of the giant water plant, the Victoria Rega. Pretty amazing. He started, I guess, as a gardener, and just his gardening background, that was his inspiration. We've got James Wetmore. How about this guy? 19 years he was the U.S. government's chief architect, but he never was an architect. He actually started a really interesting article here. Here's the Washington Post, falling apart, but he was the supervising architect of the Treasury. James Wetmore, architect but not an architect, well known and yet obscure, one of Washington's most interesting personalities, will retire from public life on November 30th. 71 years old, 49-year veteran of the federal government, the architect who was never an architect. And then Christopher Wren, the very famous architect. I love this. Really interesting facts here, all from, actually one here from John Hicks we'll finish on, but a couple from Elsie Hicks. At the age of 78, he was hoisted to the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral in a basket, basically, to supervise the construction. And this is great, from the British Information Services. I love this. Architect Sir Christopher Wren was pleased when he was told his magnificent St. Paul's Cathedral was amusing, awful, and artificial. How about that? And then the British Information Services sent that in and said, yes, this is true, because at the time, amusing meant engaging the mind or attention in a pleasing way, mentally arresting or distracting, absorbing. Awful actually meant solemnly impressive, sublimely majestic, and then artificial at the time meant made by art or artifice, brought about by constructive skill. So those words used to describe, he thought, what a nice thing to say. And then the final one, I love this. This is a really interesting story. But the pillars of the Windsor, England Town Hall don't reach the ceiling. This is a little story of architectural pride here. Sir Christopher Wren partly built the town hall in 1686. When the town councilors found there were no pillars to support the ceiling, they complained to him, and they said, and Wren said, well, look, I designed it in such a way that the ceiling was perfect. You don't need pillars. And the councilors, however, demanded that he put the pillars in. And then when he put them in, he purposefully, when the chamber was being cleaned, they found the pillars were about an inch short of the ceiling. So he built the pillars, but he never connected them, just in a little act of defiance. So that wraps it up for this week's episode on miscellaneous construction and architects. Thank you so much for joining. If you like content like this or just want to support bringing back this 98-year-old brand for the digital age, please hit the bell to subscribe, hit the button to like, and by all means leave a comment. Your engagement goes a long way to helping me bring this brand back for the 21st century. And I'll wrap this episode up, as I always do every week, with a quote from John Hicks in his first book, Strange as It Seems, where he writes, "The author launches this book of the curious in nature and humankind on the vast sea of public opinion, with the hope that it will fulfill its mission to entertain and acquaint its readers with some of the marvels of the world in which we live."